There's a peeping Tom in my neighborhood, but he's no ordinary stalker. Mom? I asked, why are you closing the blinds? Our neighborhood has a peeping Tom, she responded, peering with a single eye into the gloom of suburbia in winter. I didn't know exactly what my mother was looking for, but I knew she was nervous, and that made me nervous. I was 8 years old that Christmas, and the words peeping Tom meant nothing to me. I knew that peepers was another word for eye, and I couldn't help but imagine the mad, rolling eyeballs and black hat of Judge Doom in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It had been over a month since I'd seen that movie, but it still gave me nightmares. In my mind, the sinister, crazy-faced, glassy-eyed peeping Tom was a monster that crept through our neighborhood with huge cartoonish strides, pressing his rubbery white face against our windows at night. Unable to sleep, I lay watching the shadows of the trees on my bedroom wall, trying to convince myself that they weren't peeping Tom's two long fingers. The next morning, however, I had to face something even more frightening than peeping Tom. My mother insisted on walking me to the bus stop. Just to be safe, she said, but she wouldn't have to endure the sneers and laughter of classmates for the rest of the year. It started as soon as I got on the bus, a loud chant from the back of Mama's boy. Mama's boy, that felt like it would never end. Trying to ignore them, I looked out the window. And what I saw chilled my blood. My mother was walking home alone, and a figure in the bushes was watching her. A figure in a broad-billed black hat and battered black trench coat. From the fast-moving school bus window, I couldn't see its crazy round eyes, but I knew that they were there all the same. "Wait!" I screamed. "Stop the bus!" Laughter. The chants of Mama's boy grew louder. The driver ignored me. At school, I couldn't focus on anything. What if the peeping Tom had crept up on my mother with those impossibly long, silent steps? What if it had wrapped a filthy, black-gloved hand around her mouth and dragged her away? What if? I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw my mother waiting expectantly at the bus stop that afternoon. Instead of trying to wriggle away, I grabbed her hand and squeezed it tight. There were worse things than my classmates teasing out there, I realized. Things that hid in the bushes and crept through the dark. Things like a peeping Tom. That evening, I muted my video game to listen to my mother's conversation with one of her friends on our street, Evelyn. Apparently, Evelyn had come out of the shower to find a man in a black hat and trench coat rummaging through her drawers. Why anyone would want to try to steal dumb girls' clothes was beyond me, but Evelyn sure seemed to be plenty scared about it. Although if the peeping Tom was anything like what I imagined, I would have been, too. My mother invited Evelyn to stay the night with us. I breathed a sigh of relief when she refused. Evelyn smelled like cloves and was always asking me questions when I just wanted to play. The police were parked outside her house, Evelyn told my mother, and besides, Claire would be home soon. Claire was the woman who lived with Evelyn, although I wasn't exactly sure how they knew each other. My mother did my best to reassure our neighbor before she hung up. "At least there hasn't been any more violence," she said in a low voice. I couldn't hear Evelyn's response. It sounded like she was shushing my mother, hurrying to get off the line. My mother's words were far from comforting. How did she know that this peeping Tom hadn't hid a bunch of dead bodies in the woods by the park? Maybe following people and breaking into their houses was just the beginning. Maybe the peeping Tom was just getting warmed up. And why had she said any more violence? Had this sort of thing happened before? Was it just something normal adults had to deal with? At 8 years old, I had no idea. I closed my curtains that night. Just to be safe, as my mother had said. But that didn't make it any easier to sleep. Especially once I heard that fleshy, squelching noise against the glass. It sounded an awful lot like a tongue. I sat up in bed, and whatever was out there began to scrape long fingernails on the glass. "Mom?" I whispered. The noises grew louder, frantic and hungry. Any minute now, it would break through. "Mom!" I screamed. As my mother wrestled out of bed, running footsteps crossed the roof outside my window, then disappeared. My mother saw me pointing at the curtains and yanked them back, baseball bat at the ready. But there was nothing outside but darkness. Peeping Tom. I panted. My mother stuck her head out, looked for evidence, frowned. "Honey, are you sure you didn't just have a bad dream?" I shook my head. Couldn't she see the spit streak on the glass? "Well, I'll call it in, but I don't want you to worry. The police are out looking for the bad guy, and they're going to catch him." I thought about how rapidly those footsteps crossed the roof. I doubted the police could move that fast. I slept in my mother's room that night, and although she constantly reassured me that it was just a dream, I noticed she laid the bat within her reach by the nightstand. The next night, Claire showed up crying on our porch just before midnight. Everyone introduced her as Evelyn's friend, but even at 8 years old, I knew that there was a lot more to it than that. It was in how Claire touched Evelyn's back when they came over for my mother's parties, how they laughed and finished each other's sentences. And that was the problem. Eavesdropping from the top of the stairs, I picked up the drift right away. Evelyn had disappeared. And while Claire was sure that the neighborhood Peeping Tom was responsible, the police had fixated on Evelyn's deviant lifestyle. And that meant Claire. In those days, certain types of relationships just weren't talked about or tolerated by most people, and anyone who participated in them was suspicious by default. Of course, I didn't understand any of that back then, but I did focus on one detail that Claire confessed to my mother. The police cruiser parked outside Evelyn and Claire's home had left its position when a sighting of the Peeping Tom had been called in, my sighting. My guts knotted up. I was partly responsible for Evelyn's disappearance. The Peeping Tom might have planned it all along, scaring me, distracting the police patrol, then breaking in to take Evelyn. Back in my room, I gripped my pocket knife until my knuckles turned white, swearing that I'd give that damn Peeping Tom what he had coming to him. But it was not to be. After Evelyn's disappearance, the sightings of the Peeping Tom came to an end. The intimidating, shark-like police cruisers that had patrolled our neighborhood were gone, leaving behind only the empty windows of the home that Claire and Evelyn had shared. They stared at me accusingly whenever I walked by. While Claire was ultimately found not guilty of Evelyn's murder, the experience left a rotten taste in her mouth, and no one was surprised when she left without a forwarding address. I didn't think about her again until a few years later, when my friends and I were trying our first cigarette in a ramshackle shed we'd found in the woods behind the park. My first lungful made me cough and lurch forward. My foot went straight through the rotten floor. There was a ladder underneath. It led down into a bare concrete basement that had probably been sealed off for years. But the scent down there was familiar. Evelyn's clove perfume. I shuddered, made up a lame excuse, and hurried home. I felt the need to tell an adult what I'd found, but by the time I reached my front door, I was having second thoughts. If I told anyone about the shed, I'd have to explain what we were doing there. I didn't want to get my friends in trouble. I could still smell that nasty cigarette smoke on my clothes. What if the adults could smell it too? Besides, I didn't have any real evidence, just a familiar scent. I decided to hide my clothes at the bottom of the laundry pile, take a shower, and keep my mouth shut. My family moved away a few months later, and I forgot all about the Peeping Tom and my discovery in the shed, until last night, something happened that jogged my memory. I went to bed early and woke to my wife shaking me and whispering in my ear. "Honey? I think there's a guy in the bushes beside our house." I sprung out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside the nightstand. The grip felt cold in my hand as I ran to the patio door. I flicked on the outside light and jumped outside. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping that I sounded more intimidating than I felt. "Who's there?" There was no response, but I could feel eyes on me. I couldn't help but imagine the eyes from my childhood nightmares, huge, bloodshot, and insane. The eyes of the Peeping Tom. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I jostled the first bush with the bat, hoping, no, praying, that I wouldn't see some awful thing draped in a nasty trenchcoat and broad-brimmed black hat staring back at me from the other side of the leaves. My wife, Kim, stood in the kitchen, one hand on a butcher knife, the other on her phone, ready to call the police. As I approached the third, I heard Kim scream. Nothing was hiding in the branches, but I turned around in time to see a long shadow scurry across our backyard and disappear into the trees beside the power lines. The figure that cast it wore a filthy trench coat and a familiar black hat. We called the authorities immediately. They told us that no one nearby had reported being a stalker, but that they'd increase patrols in the area. There wasn't much more that they could do, and I resolved to take matters into my own hands. What disturbed me the most was that the peeping Tom I'd seen had looked identical to the one from my childhood nightmares. It shouldn't have been possible, and yet. Spurred on by my disquieting memories, I did something I'd promised myself I'd never do. I started searching for my childhood neighbors on social media. Kim was snoring softly in the bedroom beside my office. The doors were locked and I had my trusty bat beside my desk, but none of it made me feel any more secure in light of the new information I uncovered. It seemed that almost all of my childhood friends had ordinary lives, some heartbreaks, some joy, a sprinkling of drama. The occasional run-in with police, drug addiction, or wildly successful career. For almost all of them, the stories were nearly the same. But for the families who'd lived on Maidsway Court, my street back then, it was a different story. Evelyn wasn't the only one who'd vanished. Over the past 20 years, there had been 5 disappearances, 3 unexplained deaths, and 2 suicides. Something horrible was happening to my childhood neighbors. Dread settled into my gut like a cold stone when I recalled their houses, their faces, their quirks, the junk they had in their yards the moment I looked at a street view map of my old street. The horrifying pattern became obvious. The bad luck haunting my childhood neighbors moved from left to right, beginning at Evelyn's house. Even though almost everyone on my street had moved away in the years following Evelyn's disappearance, the pattern remained the same. Someone or something was destroying our lives one by one, and my family was next. I called my mother right away, but she didn't pick up. That was disquieting enough in itself. My mother always left her phone at full volume, day or night, and always kept it by her side. I shook Kim awake, bundled her into a coat, and brought her down to the car. I knew that my incoherent explanation of where we were going and what we were doing had scared her, but if I was right, she wasn't nearly as scared as she should have been. I drove in white-knuckled silence, pulling into my mother's driveway after completing the 2-hour drive in less than an hour 20. Every light in the house was on, and the curtains of the open living room window were blowing in the breeze. I rushed inside, bat in hand. Kim and I searched my mother's house again and again, but there was no sign of her. My mother's bed was a mess, and I could already imagine how it might have gone. The man in black could have slipped in through the window, tiptoed upstairs, pressed a chloroform cloth over her mouth, and dragged her out to the woods. My mother's address book lay on her nightstand. I flipped it open and struck gold. She kept in touch with people from Maidsway Court. I had at least 5 phone numbers to try. While Kim busied herself with shutting the living room window and checking the other locks, I called my ex-neighbor's phone numbers in the order that they were written. Hello, a gruff man answered on the 4th ring. Dave? This is Bryce Leeds. You lived on Maidsway Court in the 90s, right? Bryce? That skinny kid from the end of the road. Look, Bryce, do you have any idea what fucking time it is? I gotta work tomorrow. I know and I'm sorry, but my mother is missing. I pleaded. I need to know what you know. Click. The next number wasn't one I would have called if I'd had a choice, Claire. Even though I was only a child at the time, I still felt some guilt over how everyone had treated her. She picked up right away. This is Bryce Leeds. I said immediately. My mother is missing and... So it's true. Claire gasped. There really is no escape. No escape from what? What everyone on Maidsway Court did when you were just a toddler. What are you talking about? Look, my mother. Listen! Claire shouted. I sat on the unmade bed and did as I was told. Back then, there was a hobo who lived in a shack in the woods by the name of Tom Callforth. Tom was, how can I put it, a dirty old man. He said filthy things to every woman and girl he saw, sometimes he even followed us home. He got off on our fear, I think, and he took to spying on the women of Maid's Way Court every night. He'd creep right up to our windows, and even snuck into our homes and left traces of his presence, just to make us feel unsafe. The police would haul him off, but with no physical evidence they could never hold him for long. One day, he approached Evelyn while she was working alone in the garden, spewing his usual filth. He got so close that she could smell his foul breath on her face, and when he tried to touch her, Claire paused. You have to understand how afraid we were back then. Everyone was at a boiling point. We just wanted him, that man we called Dirty Tom, out of our lives. That's why Evelyn hit him in the head with a shovel. He went down hard, bleeding, and swore he'd sue her and take everything we had, so she hit him again. And again. Dave across the street and your mother heard the screams and came running. Eventually, everyone else did too. No one felt shock or horror at what Evelyn had done. We felt relief. Dirty Tom Callforth was finally out of our lives and nobody would miss him. We buried him in the woods beside his shed and never told a soul. That's horrible, but what does it have to do with my mother going missing? Don't you get it? Dirty Tom isn't resting peacefully. He's getting his revenge, hurting our families one by one. The front door opened downstairs. Where was Kim? I sprung to my feet, grabbed my bat, and ran to the hallway. My mother was coming in the door. She jumped when she saw me. Bryce! What are you doing here? I just got a call from the hospital saying you were in the ER, but when I drove there. Did you see Kim on your way in? I grabbed my mother's shoulders. No, should I have? She sounded puzzled. What's going on? Get in the car. I'm going to pay a visit to Tom Callforth. My mother's jaw dropped. I talked to Claire, Mom. I know everything, and I understand, but we have got to finish this. Whatever Tom Callforth became, I think it's got Kim. The sky was brightening when we pulled into the empty parking lot of my childhood park 2 hours later, but the thick fog made everything gray. The streetlights looked monstrous, and the forest looked hungry. We couldn't see more than 5 feet away. Every sound in the forest made us jump. I held my mother's hand as we walked uncertainly toward the shed where I'd smoked my first cigarette, unaware that a human monster who'd filled our neighborhood with fear was buried just a stone's throw away. My mother's hand shook as she pointed to a weedy patch of dirt behind the shed. I jammed the shovel I'd taken from her garage into the dirt and started digging. I barely felt the blisters forming on my hands. My head was too full of images of my wife being dragged through the woods at inhuman speeds, and the horrific, very real possibility that a dead pervert's mindless revenge might have stolen her away forever. The blade of my shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. We buried him in an old suitcase. Dave said it would help keep animals away from the CC corpse, my mother stammered. The black plastic was worn, but intact. As I shifted away more dirt, I saw that even the zipper was still closed, almost. Would a bony hand shoot out to grab my wrist if I tried to open the gruesome container? I hesitated, then thought about Kim. I handed my mother my car keys. If anything happens to me, I murmured, run and don't look back. My mother shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Something moved in the foggy woods and we both jumped. It might have been an owl or a deer, but the message was clear, I had to hurry. To my surprise, the zipper still worked. The mist swirled around my mother and I like a living thing as I threw open the battered suitcase. Kim's terrified eyes stared up at me. She had been forcibly bent and twisted to fit into the tiny compartment, and her limbs were locked in place by the hands and feet of a rotting corpse. A corpse wearing the remains of a broad-brimmed black hat and a dirty trench coat. The corpse of Dirty Tom Callforth. With a cry, I jumped into the hole and pried the rigor mortis locked fingers off my wife's wrists. I grabbed her beneath her armpits and dragged her away from the eyeless skull grinning up at us. By night, Dirty Tom's vengeful spirit was a powerful and murderous force, but by day, he was just rotting bones in a suitcase. I held Kim. She wasn't ready to speak, but I knew she would when the time was right. My mother lifted up the other tools I had brought from my mother's garage, charcoal and a gas can. She poured them over the suitcase, said a prayer, and dropped a match. We stood in a circle and watched the past burn, hoping that it would forgive us. Hoping that maybe, this time, it wouldn't come back to haunt us.